Gary Quinn woke with the taste of rust in his mouth. The alarm beeped. 4:30 a.m., same as always, and he reached over to silence it before it woke Elaine. She'd be up in 30 minutes for her shift at the hospital cafeteria. 28 years of marriage, and they perfected the choreography of their mornings. His shower first, her coffee brewing by the time he dressed, a kiss at the door as he left with his thermos and metal lunch pail. December 29th, 2000. Just another Friday. Cold enough that his breath crystallized as he walked to his Chevy S10, the pickup's frame groaning as he settled behind the wheel. The radio crackled to life with the turn of his key. Something about the new millennium, celebrations planned for the second New Year's Eve of the 2000s. Gary twisted the dial to the traffic report. He didn't need philosophers telling him what the future might hold. He needed to know if they'd cleared the snow on I-77. The truck's heater finally kicked in as he merged onto the highway. 23 minutes later, he pulled into the LTV Steel parking lot. The massive Cleveland works rising against the pale winter sky, like a city unto itself. Blast furnaces and cooling towers punctuated the horizon, steam billowing white against gray clouds. The familiar chemical smell hit him as he stepped from the truck. Coal and sulfur, molten metal and sweat. The smell of purpose. The smell of America. Morning, Gare. Hank Wilcox nodded as they walked through the gate together. Security badges flipped toward the guard who barely glanced up. Heard anything new about the Chapter 11? Gary shrugged, keeping his eyes forward. Just rumors, same as you. Management's meeting this afternoon. Dave's gonna pass word down after. LTV had filed for bankruptcy protection earlier in the month, their second filing since '86. The papers called it restructuring, but Gary had been here 31 years. He knew what restructuring meant. My cousin over at Bethlehem says they're circling the drain too, Hank said, his voice dropping though no one was close enough to hear. Whole damn industry, man. Gary said nothing. His father had worked the same mill until black lung took him at 56. His grandfather had helped build it. Steel wasn't just Gary's job. It was the architecture of his existence, the scaffolding his entire life was built upon. He clocked in, pulled on his safety gear, and walked into the hot strip finishing department where he'd spent the last 18 years as a roller operator. The noise enveloped him like an embrace, the thundering machinery, metal on metal, the hiss of cooling systems and shouts of men who'd mastered the art of communicating above the din. Gary took his position at the control panel, nodding to Pete Chambers who was finishing night shift. Their handoff was wordless but precise, status of the line, adjustments needed, what to watch for. Then Gary was alone with the rolling mill, transforming slabs of heated steel into sheets of precise thickness. It was skilled work. Work that had bought his house on West 127th Street. Work that had put his daughter Melissa through nursing school. Work that had defined him since he was 20 years old, fresh back from a tour in Vietnam with nothing but nightmares and a need to build something lasting. Quinn, Dave Kowalski shouted over the noise around noon. Need you in the break room at 1. Meeting. Gary nodded, his stomach tightening. Meetings during shift never meant anything good. The break room was packed by the time Gary arrived. Men stood against walls, sat on tables, filled every chair. Dave stood at the front, his face ashen. Gary had known Dave for 15 years, from floor supervisor to department manager, and he'd never seen him look this way. Just got word. Dave began, his voice steady but hollow. Corporate announcement comes tomorrow, but they wanted us to hear it first. He paused, looking down at the paper in his hands. LTV is suspending operations. Indefinitely. Effective immediately. The silence that followed felt physical, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. What's that mean, exactly? Someone finally asked. It means we're shutting down, Dave said. All Cleveland operations. Complete closure. They're laying off everyone. 18,000 across all divisions. 18,000. The number hit Gary like a physical blow. Not just their department. Not just Cleveland Works. Everything. Every LTV facility. Severance. Someone else called out. They're still working that out with the union. There's bankruptcy court involved now, Dave said, unable to meet their eyes. They want us to finish today's shift, power down equipment in sequence. HR will be setting up in the main hall tomorrow with paperwork. Questions erupted from every corner, but Gary heard none of them. A high-pitched whine filled his ears as his vision narrowed to a pinpoint. 31 years. His entire adult life. He forced himself to focus as Dave continued. This isn't like 86. They're not expecting to reopen. Foreign steel's too cheap. The mini-mills are eating us alive. The new administration isn't looking to prop us up. Gary watched the men around him. Some argued, faces flushed with anger. Others stood silent, stunned. A few younger guys huddled near the door, already talking about other mills, other cities, other options. I know this is hard, Dave was saying. I'm in the same boat. 26 years for me. But we do this right. We shut her down with dignity. Then we figure out what's next. Somehow, Gary finished his shift. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind raced through calculations. Mortgage payments, health insurance, pension questions. They had some savings. Elaine's job at the hospital wasn't much, but it was something. Melissa might be able to help, though she had student loans to pay off. He powered down his station with mechanical precision, each toggle switch and dial adjustment executed exactly as he'd been trained. When the rolling mill finally went silent, the absence of sound was so complete it made his ears ring. The locker room was somber. Men who normally joked and laughed changed in silence. Gary removed his steel-toed boots, hard hat, and safety glasses, placing them in his locker for what might be the last time. Beer at McGuire's? Hank asked as they walked to the parking lot. Gary shook his head. Got to tell Elaine. The drive home felt longer than usual. His truck's radio announcer cheerfully discussed New Year's Eve plans while Gary's world collapsed. He turned it off. Elaine was at the stove when he walked in, stirring a pot of chili. She turned with a smile that faded as soon as she saw his face. What is it? She asked, setting down her spoon. Gary stood in the doorway, unable to move further into the kitchen. LTV's done. We're all laid off. 18,000 of us. The words came out flat, as if he were reading them from a script. Elaine crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. She was small against his frame, but solid. Real. We'll figure it out, she whispered against his chest. We always do. But this wasn't a temporary layoff or a seasonal adjustment. This was the end of something that had defined Cleveland for generations. The end of what had defined Gary Quinn. That night, he couldn't sleep. He slipped from bed at 2 a.m. and went to the garage, where he kept his father's tools in a red metal box. He ran his fingers over wrenches and hammers worn smooth by decades of use. Tools that had built things that lasted, or were supposed to last. The next morning, Gary drove back to the plant out of habit, only realizing his mistake halfway there. He redirected to the Union Hall, where hundreds of men already waited in line for information about benefits and severance. The mood was darker than the day before, anger replacing shock. Vultures already circling, muttered the man ahead of him. Got a call from some headhunter wanting to know if I'd relocate to South Carolina. Non-union shop offering half what I made here. Gary nodded. He'd expect those calls soon too. At 51, he wasn't old, but he wasn't young enough to start over at the bottom somewhere else. Not young enough to learn computers or go back to school like the counselors would inevitably suggest. The line inched forward. Gary calculated that at this rate, he'd reach the front sometime around noon. He settled in to wait, listening to the conversations around him. Japan's flooding the market with cheap steel. It's the mini-mills. Those non-union operations. Government should have stepped in. They did in '86. My cousin works for the city. Says they're predicting a 30% population drop in the next decade. Everyone's leaving. Gary had heard it all before. The slow death of American manufacturing told in 1,000 small cuts. But hearing didn't make it real. Standing in this line made it real. When he finally reached the front, a harried union rep handed him a stack of papers explaining his options. Unemployment benefits would last 6 months. His pension was safe, probably, though there might be adjustments depending on what happened in bankruptcy court. Health coverage would continue for 90 days. There would be job fairs. There would be retraining programs. Sign here, the rep said, pointing to a form. And here, and initial here. Gary signed where indicated, his signature a jagged line across the page. 31 years reduced to paperwork. Outside, a news van had arrived. A young reporter stopped men as they exited, microphone extended, asking how they felt about the closure. Gary walked past her, eyes fixed on his truck. She didn't need his words to fill her 30-second segment. His face said enough. January passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Gary filed for unemployment, called about his pension, researched health insurance options. He applied for jobs at the remaining manufacturers in the region, but they were flooded with applications from former LTV workers. No one was hiring. Everyone was waiting to see if they'd be next. February brought snow and silence. Gary took to rising at his usual time, putting on work clothes, and sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper's help wanted section. The positions advertised required computer skills or college degrees or youth, things Gary didn't have and couldn't acquire quickly enough. "There's an opening at the hospital," Elaine said one evening. "Maintenance. It's not great money, but it's steady, and the benefits are good." Gary nodded, unable to form words around the lump in his throat. Maintenance. Fixing things that broke, not making things that lasted. He applied anyway. They hired him at $12 an hour, less than half what he'd made at LTV, but more than nothing. The night before his first day, he polished his work boots and laid out clean clothes, just as he had for 31 years at the mill. The hospital smelled wrong, antiseptic and artificial. The fluorescent lights made his head ache. His supervisor was younger than Melissa, with a clipboard and a patient tone that made Gary feel ancient. "We'll start you on the easy stuff," she said, leading him to a supply closet filled with mops and plungers. "Work your way up to the electrical and HVAC systems." Gary nodded, taking the work order she handed him. A clogged toilet on the third floor. A broken paper towel dispenser in the lobby restroom. A flickering light in the cafeteria. That first day stretched endlessly. His body, accustomed to the physical demands of the mill, felt restless with these simple tasks. His mind, trained to monitor complex systems and make split-second adjustments, grew bored with tightening screws and replacing light bulbs. He saw Elaine briefly during her lunch break. She introduced him to her co-workers as "my husband, Gary," not as Gary from LTV, the identity he'd carried for decades. "How's it going?" she asked, squeezing his hand under the table. "Fine," he said. "Different." By April, a routine had formed. Wake, work, home, sleep. The paychecks came regularly, if smaller than before. They cut back. No more dinners out. No new clothes. No weekend trips to see Melissa in Columbus. They would survive, Gary told himself. That's what mattered. But in the quiet moments, usually late at night when Elaine slept beside him, Gary felt something he couldn't name eating away at his insides. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something deeper. In June, Gary drove past the Cleveland Works on his way to pick up parts for the hospital's backup generator. The massive complex stood silent, a steel ghost town. Weeds already pushed through cracks in the parking lot. A fence surrounded the property, topped with barbed wire to keep out scrappers. He pulled over, engine idling, and stared at the place that had been the center of his existence. Inside those walls, he had been Gary Quinn, roller operator, union man, respected for his skill and precision. Outside them, he was just another middle-aged man struggling to reinvent himself. A security guard appeared at the gate, eyeing Gary's truck suspiciously. Gary put the truck in gear and drove on. That night, he dreamed of the mill, the heat and noise, the camaraderie, the satisfaction of watching raw materials become something useful, something necessary. He woke at 3 a.m. with sweat soaking his pillow and the taste of rust in his mouth again. Elaine stirred beside him. "Bad dream," she murmured. "Just the mill again," he said. She propped herself up on one elbow, fully awake now. "Gary, I've been thinking. Maybe we should consider moving. Melissa says Columbus has more opportunities. Her hospital's always hiring." The suggestion hung between them, heavy with implication. Leave Cleveland. Leave the only place they'd ever called home. Admit defeat. "This is where we belong," Gary said finally. "Is it? Still?" Elaine asked softly. "Or are we holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore?" The question followed Gary through the summer and into fall. He continued his work at the hospital, gradually earning more responsibilities as he proved himself reliable. He watched other former steelworkers scatter, some to different cities, some to different industries, some to unemployment lines and food banks when their benefits ran out. In October, the local news reported that LTV had sold its assets to a company called International Steel Group. There was talk of reopening some facilities, but with a fraction of the workforce and significantly lower wages. The union was fighting it, but without much hope. Gary followed the story obsessively, scanning newspapers and listening to call-in shows on his drive to work. Part of him hoped for a miracle, that somehow, the mill would roar back to life, and everything would return to normal. The rational part knew better. The first anniversary of the closure approached. Local papers ran retrospectives, economists analyzed the impact, politicians made statements about retraining and reinvention. Gary avoided them all. On December 29, 2001, exactly 1 year after the announcement, Gary rose before dawn as usual. Instead of putting on his hospital uniform, he dressed in his old work clothes: jeans, flannel shirt, steel-toed boots. He left a note for Elaine and drove to Lake Erie. The shoreline was deserted in the winter pre-dawn. Gary parked and walked to the water's edge, watching the first light break over the horizon. The lake stretched before him, vast and implacable. He could just make out the silhouette of the boats, fewer now than in years past, bringing raw materials to the mills that still operated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his LTV ID badge, the plastic worn smooth from years of use. His younger face stared back at him, confident and unaware of what was coming. For months, he'd carried this badge everywhere. A talisman, a reminder of who he had been, of what had defined him. Gary drew back his arm and hurled the badge into the lake. It disappeared with a small splash, leaving only ripples that quickly faded into the vastness of the water. He stood for a long time watching the sun rise fully, casting golden light across the industrial skyline of Cleveland. The city was still here, changed, wounded, struggling to redefine itself, but still here. Just like him. When he returned home, Elaine was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked at his work clothes with a question in her eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said," Gary told her. "About Columbus." She set down the coffee pot. And I think we should visit Melissa. See what it's like." He paused. "I'm not saying we'll move. Just that we should look." Elaine smiled, understanding what this concession had cost him. "That sounds reasonable." Later that day, Gary went to the garage and opened his father's toolbox again. He ran his hands over the worn tools, each one carrying memories of projects completed, problems solved, things built and maintained. He'd been avoiding this box since the layoff, seeing it as a reminder of what he'd lost. Now he saw it differently. These were just tools. The skill was in the hands that held them. His father hadn't been defined by where he worked, but by what he could do, by who he was to his family, by how he faced challenges. Gary selected a hammer and a set of screwdrivers. The back steps needed fixing. The kitchen cabinet hinge was loose. The bathroom faucet leaked. His house, the house he'd paid for with 31 years at the mill, needed his attention. Steel had given him a livelihood, but it had never been who he was. That realization didn't erase the pain of the loss or the uncertainty of the future, but it created space for something new to grow, something more resilient than even steel. He closed the toolbox and went inside to tell Elaine he was going to fix the steps. Tomorrow, he'd call Melissa about visiting Columbus. The day after that, who knew? For the first time since the closure, the not knowing felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Cleveland would adapt. Gary Quinn would adapt. The furnaces might never roar again as they once had, but there were other ways to forge a life. Other ways to matter. Other ways to build something that would last.